History tends to set its spotlight on those who ascended thrones and signed decrees, while the people who tended their rooms soothed their children and kept the rhythm of their days move quietly at the edge of the frame. This is the story of one such life, Anne Pullman, whose path ran from a modest, complicated beginning in rural Devon to the inner machinery of Queen Victoria's household. For decades she served within Buckingham Palace, a steady figure in the background of great occasions, trusted enough to care for the Queen's youngest child, Princess Beatrice. The question is how a young woman from a small parish found her way to that guarded world. The answer begins, as so many 19th century lives do, on the pages of a parish register. In the parish attached to a Devon pottery, a single line written in an early August hand gives us our first sure footing. On 4th of August 1833, a baby girl was baptised and entered into the book as Anne Farren Pullman. The clerk recorded her mother as Sarah Pullman, and where a father's name should have stood, there is a space left bare. That blank tells its own story. Anne was born outside marriage, and the fact that she carried her mother's surname, spelled Pullman in some years and Pullman in others, as spelling settled slowly in rural ledgers, confirms the point. In the 830s, such a beginning carried stigma and practical hardship. The parish, still under the old poor law order before the 1834 reforms, bore the duty of supporting its poor, but that did not mean it named every father or softened the weight of reputation. Yet the entry offers another clue. Farren, sitting between given name and surname, looks very much like a family name, placed where a middle name would be. It may point toward a paternal line that was recognised, if not printed in full. When we test the simpler possibility that Farren was the maiden name of Anne's maternal grandmother, we find no match. The name remains as a thin thread, a hint of the father's identity preserved in the only space left to record it. From that spare notation we must ask what life looked like for a child marked by such beginnings. The next broad, reliable view comes with the nationwide snapshot taken in 1841, when Britain attempted for the first time to count every soul in a single night. In the hamlet of Roeridge, within the parish linked to the pottery, a girl appears who fits our Anne. Her name is written with a single U, a trivial variation, and her age is given as 8, exactly what we would expect for a child baptised in 1833, since the 1841 enumerators tended to round adult ages, but recorded children more exactly. Her birthplace is given simply as Devon, anchoring her in the right county. She is not in her mother Sarah's household. Instead, she is listed alongside Samuel Pullman, about 65, and Joan Pullman, the same age. That census did not state relationships, a gap that often forces us to infer. Here the simplest inference is also the strongest one. The older couple are likely grandparents who had taken their daughter's child into their home. The picture is of a country girl being raised within her kin, close to the lanes and fields that framed her first years. A decade on, the 1851 census opens a wider window. By then, Anne should be 17 or 18, the age at which many rural daughters entered service. Domestic work offered food, a bed, a wage, and the chance to leave the narrow opportunities of a village. The return for that year does indeed place an Anne Pullman, 17, born in the pottery parish, living in nearby Honiton. She is enumerated as a house servant on New Street in the household of Emily Woodgates, a 25-year-old schoolmistress. The home is lively with sisters, a language teacher, and young scholars, suggesting a small school or academy. And in that busy setting, Anne learned the routines of a larger house. Early fires, linen in rotation, children to corral, rooms to keep in order. The identifying details line up cleanly. Name, age, and birthplace. It is the same Anne. She has taken her first step away from Roeridge into a town that moved faster, with more doors and more people who might sign their names beneath a testimonial. From this point, the official trail goes briefly dark. For 7 years, the paper record withholds its clues, and then it shows Anne stepping across the threshold of Buckingham Palace. How that leap was made can be reconstructed only by understanding how service worked in mid-Victorian Britain. One did not simply answer an advertisement to serve the monarch's household. Such positions rested on character, experience, and recommendation. The likeliest path runs through references and gradual ascent. An employer like Emily Woodgate's could have ties to families of greater means, or Anne may have moved from Honiton into a larger, more genteel household closer to London, where her manner and reliability were noticed by someone with entry to court circles. A layered progression, housemaid to upper housemaid, nursery assistant to nursery maid, fits the pattern. Careful work observed by a senior servant, a written reference praising honesty, steadiness, and discretion, and then a quiet word spoken in the right corridor. Background inquiries would have followed. Royal employment demanded a spotless reputation. However the steps arranged themselves, those unrecorded years are the span in which Anne's diligence proved itself to be more than habit. She had become the sort of servant whose name could be carried forward without risk. The missing bridge is supplied by a document that does not live among parish volumes or civic ledgers, but in the papers of the Lord Chamberlain's department. There a staff register fixes the turning point with dispassionate precision. On 18th May 1858, Anne Pullman entered royal service and was placed in the nursery at Buckingham Palace. The same record assigns her a birth date of 7th May 1833, which fits neatly with a baptism in early August. Infant baptisms often followed weeks or months after birth, especially in rural places. With that entry, Anne's daily world changed. She was now one cog in a well-ordered team tending the youngest members of the royal family. The nursery was its own universe, with a hierarchy of nurses and nursery maids, schedules calibrated to royal movement, and trunks ready for the seasonal migrations of the court between Buckingham Palace, Windsor, Osborne on the Isle of Wight, and Balmoral. The tasks could be tender or exacting by turns, calming fevers, managing clothing lists, keeping track of toys and linen, ensuring that small lives ticked along without friction in rooms that the public would never see. Those first years unfolded against a background of griefs that retuned the entire household. In March 1861, the Duchess of Kent, Queen Victoria's mother, died, and the court entered mourning. Mourning in the Victorian sense was not an idea but a regimen. Fabrics, timetables, entertainments, the very manner of movement. The feeling in the nursery would have been muted, but the change would have been felt in dress and tempo. Then came the blow that reshaped the remainder of Victoria's reign. On 14th December 1861, Prince Albert died. The Queen withdrew into a long season of mourning that lasted not weeks but decades. The court's atmosphere settled into a quieter, more restrained mode, and all departments adjusted. For those who dealt with clothing and linen, this had practical consequences. Black trimmings, altered wardrobes, a new rhythm of care and replacement. But even in rooms set aside for children, the solemnity seeped in. The mood changing the air, the staff breathed. Even in sorrow, the calendar demanded pageantry. Royal weddings in 1862 and 1863, first Princess Alice's nuptials at Osborne House, then the grander wedding of the Prince of Wales at Windsor, created a tide of logistics that pulled in staff from every corner. The nursery's share might include travel, special outfits and their safekeeping, and schedules adjusted to rehearsals and ceremonies. Somewhere in these years, Anne's place in the nursery sharpened into particular responsibility. An index compiled from household records shows that from 1866 to 1868, she served as personal nursery maid to Princess Beatrice, the Queen's youngest. That appointment meant trust on a more intimate scale. A personal nursery maid helped shape the daily world of one child, dressings, routines, small comforts when illness or fretfulness struck, and stood continually in the line of sight of those who watched closest over the royal children. To hold that place for 2 years confirms what experience had already suggested. Anne had the steadiness and tact that such proximity demanded. During this period, she would have stood not far from the aisle when another sister, Princess Helena, married at Windsor in 1866. The nursery's charge did not stretch to the altar, but its presence hovered at the edge of such days. After a decade in childcare, Anne's path bent toward a different specialty within the household. In September 1868, an instruction moved her into the linen room at Buckingham Palace as an assistant. That shift might look like a sidestep from the outside, but within a great house, the linen room was a nerve centre, controlling fabrics that touched every department, bedroom sheets and towels, tablecloths, a vast span for state banquets, napery for daily meals, and the delicate textiles that signalled rank and ritual. On 1st July 1869, the change became formal. She was named Linen Room Woman, succeeding Sarah Jones, who had resigned. The title carried real responsibility. Inventory had to be kept current. Ordering required foresight and judgment. Damaged items needed to be mended or retired. And the royal laundry had to be managed with an eye to both economy and perfection. The 1871 census captures this new reality with unusual neatness. At Buckingham Palace, an Anne Pullman, 37, appears as a servant, her occupation given plainly as Linen Room Woman, her birthplace once again tied back to the Pottery Parish in Devon. The small details, age, role, origin, align as cleanly as threads in a hem. The palace was not immune to alarms. In February 1822, Arthur O'Connor attempted to attack the Queen, an event that tightened security and stirred even the quietest apartments. Those responsible for the movement of objects would have felt it in new checks, altered access, the weight of caution laid on ordinary routines. Life settled into the mixture that defines long service, humdrum cycles broken by sudden intensities. By 1881, Anne appears again where we would expect her to be, still at Buckingham Palace, now 47, with her occupation recorded as linen keeper. The years around her show griefs that reach deep into the Queen's private circle. John Brown's death in 1883, the loss of Prince Leopold in 1884, each event pulling the court back into mourning with its attendant patterns. And yet another kind of day approached, one that would turn the linen room into a campaign headquarters. In 1885, Princess Beatrice married, a moment that must have touched Anne personally, since she had once watched over the princess as a child. Outfits and trousseau required meticulous preparation. Chapel linens had to be immaculate. Every white fold would be read as a sign of care. By the mid-1880s, experience had given Anne a kind of second sight for the rhythm of the household. Ordinary weeks moved like a loom. Deliveries checked, tallies entered, sheets and table linen counted in and out with a pencil that rarely blunted. Then, without much warning, a great occasion would surge across the calendar and everything would accelerate. In 1885, it was Princess Beatrice's wedding that set the pace. For Anne, this was not only a matter of inventory, but a memory brought to maturity. The little girl, whose bedtime routines she had once tended, was now a bride, and the linens that framed that day, altar cloth, fair white napery for family meals, heavier damasks for receptions, passed through Anne's hands. Her care was never seen by the crowds, but it did not need to be. Perfection in a palace often hides in what the eye assumes has always been flawless. To understand why the linen room mattered, one must picture its geography and flow. Presses stood close and deep as bookcases, each shelf holding a tier of folded cloth labelled in a hand, meant to be read at a glance. Guest suites, household bedrooms, nursery reserves, dining service by size and border pattern, separate stacks for Windsor, Osborne, Balmoral. A ledger, often two, sat open on a high desk, where entries were written the moment items moved. The room was a crossroad. Messengers came from the stillroom. Stewards arrived from the chief table. Laundresses fetched and returned by rota. A single mislaid cloth could unsettle a dinner. A late arrival from the laundry could ripple outward until it touched the household's public face. Anne's job was to absorb those ripples so the surface remained smooth. There were days when the job's gentler threads showed themselves. Palace life was not only state banquets and mourning lists, it was also a quiet churn of family practice. After a spell of illness, rooms were aired and changed more frequently. When a child returned from travel, the smaller linens, the ones that softened elbows and cheeks, were refreshed faster than usual and set aside with their familiar patterns. Even the folds mattered. Large damask cloths to cover the long tables had to lie so that creases would fall exactly where the table edges demanded. Napkins, folded in a house style that shifted with fashion and occasion, had to be crisp without a scorch. Those standards were kept by habit, not threat, and habit had to be taught. Anne taught it by example, not speech, correcting with a fingertip or the weight of a look rather than a scold. Then the year 1887 arrived, and with it the kind of preparation the household would remember in shorthand for the rest of their lives. The Queen's Golden Jubilee. Across the city, carpenters and drapers built the visible celebration. Inside Buckingham Palace, the linen room became what one colleague later called a war station. Cloth had to be counted not in dozens, but in hundreds. Banquet tables multiplied across rooms and on the day itself reached like a pale river. Napkins were pressed and stacked in marching ranks. Spare sets were prepared for contingencies that senior servants whispered about in corridors, an extra table to be added at the last moment, a spill to be covered without fuss, a visiting dignitary lodged unexpectedly in a suite that required a different monogram. The linen room's clock seemed louder that month. Lists were checked, then checked again by a second hand. Deliveries from the laundry arrived with steam still hiding in the folds. The Jubilee was a spectacle for the nation. For Anne, it was an exacting festival of timing and touch. Some practicalities of that season deserve notice because they speak to craft more than ceremony. Damask is beautiful and stubborn. The larger cloths will not listen to a hurried iron. They must be coaxed flat with heat and patience, and they misbehave if stored while warm. The royal cipher woven into borders must sit straight along the table's edge, or the pattern will drift, and the entire setting will look as though the room itself has tilted. The weight of such cloth, thick, old and costly, makes a bundle that two people must carry together, lest one corner drag and grey itself against a floorboard. Anne knew these truths as thoroughly as a gardener knows where the soil holds water after rain. The Golden Jubilee asked her to prove that knowledge at a scale many times larger than usual. She did so without leaving a trace of struggle on the finished scene. That was the point. Work on that level clarifies how advancement was measured in a place where rank defined almost everything. There was no parade for a job done well in the linen room, but recognition showed itself in the way other departments trusted its timings and asked for Anne by name. Requests arrived earlier rather than later because people who lived by lists knew the value of her order. When plans shifted, they came first to her desk so she could reorder the chain. Senior staff learned the rhythm of her nod and the expression that meant, "Yes, but give me an hour." Younger maids watched her fingers on a hanging tag, understood that an underline had a meaning, and began to underline their own notes with the same calm mark. That influence was soft power, the kind that keeps a house balanced without appearing to do anything at all. Between those peaks, the household moved through its familiar cycles and griefs. The death of John Brown in 1883 brought a personal sorrow into the Queen's immediate circle and changed the tone of certain corridors. The passing of Prince Leopold in 1884 drew the court once more into formal mourning with its fabrics, ribbons and rules. Such periods affected every textile decision, from the colour of a sash to the choice of a table runner, factors that would seem trifles unless one understood what those details meant to a court that read etiquette as precisely as scripture. The linen room kept pace, altering bundles, annotating ledgers with a black edge where needed, shifting out anything too light or festive for the moment. The changes did not appear dramatic on paper, but they were felt in the hand. Amid this steadiness, palace alarms sometimes cut across the order. Security responses after the attempt on the Queen in 1872 had created new habits that never entirely left, and by the later 1880s, those habits had matured into protocols. The movement of goods, including linen, often packed in trunks or hampers, bearing labels to different residences, was logged and cross-checked. Keys were counted, access to certain cupboards became narrower, then narrower again, until only 2 signatures were permitted to open them. Anne lived within those rules, with the same unruffled acceptance she brought to steam and thread. A palace is a place that remembers every exception. She made sure they were rare. Retirement, when it finally came, was not the sudden quiet many imagine. Long service brings obligations in reverse, to train replacements, to put work in order, so that nothing falls with the departing hand, to write the notes that will be useful rather than mere memorials. By 1889, Anne had given nearly 3 decades to the household, and the records show her departure as a precise date, rather than a slackening. 1st of November, 1889. The phrase used in the staff paper carries the simple dignity she would have recognised. Retired. Behind that word lay weeks of measured handover. Inventories were brought up to date, as if for inspection. Patterns of ordering were written down, with margins that explained why certain suppliers were to be preferred for one weight of linen and not for another. The cupboard that held emergency banquet cloths, the ones no one ever wants to need, was left so that a newcomer could find it in darkness. Leaving the daily march of a house like that is its own test of character. Some people go bitter at the quiet. Others do not know how to keep time without bells. Anne had been inside the palace long enough that its sounds must have nested in her, but the household intended that her life, outside its hours, would not feel like exile. The pension that followed was both a calculation and a mark of regard. The Lord Chamberlain's department set her on an annual sum of £48, and the privy purse, drawn from the sovereign's private resources, added 8 more, bringing her total to £56 a year. In a world where a domestic servant might earn no more than a few tens of pounds for hard work each year, that pension was not opulence, but it was certainty, and certainty is a kind of wealth. More striking than the money was the roof put over her remaining years. Grace and favour residences are not paid in coin, they're paid in quiet. The note attached to her pension speaks in an unadorned tone that almost hides its meaning. She occupies a cottage at Kensington Palace. To be given rooms within the precincts of a royal residence is to be wrapped in a peculiar safety. The ground is cared for. The walls are tended without argument. The post finds you even when you grow slow to answer it. For a woman who began life with her father's line unspoken, it was a consummation without ceremony, an address that required no defence. The language used to name her in that ledger, late linen room woman in Buckingham Palace, makes the gift feel like a continuation rather than a prize. Her work did not end so much as shift its centre of gravity from duty to rest. The last public glimpse of her working identity comes not from a court paper, but from the nation's own routine eye. The 1891 census would have found her beginning her new chapter, and a decade later, the 1901 return would have recorded age as a number that no longer needed apologising. Yet the view that carries the most feeling belongs to 1921, when the state's form-filling returned with unusual detail and caught her in a frame as tender as any portrait. By then she was 87, long past the reach of daily tasks, living not in a lodging off the palace grounds, but within them, in the cottage named by that pension note decades earlier. Beside her name, the enumerator wrote a single word that dignifies an entire lifetime: pensioner. Another name appears under the same roof: Jeanie Roger Warman, 45, described as an attendant. It is a small but eloquent arrangement. The elder woman whose steadiness once kept a palace's fabric immaculate now has a steady presence of her own, to watch the kettle, to lay out clothes, to make certain that stairs are taken with a hand ready near the elbow. The circle closed in a way neither sentimental nor cold, simply exact. What a record like that cannot write, memory can supply. One imagines the cottage as a place where the threadbare end of a day felt safe rather than lonely. A chair that had adapted to her back, a window that caught a late angle of sun, a small drawer where she kept the monogrammed handkerchief. The linen room had replaced years back, but she had kept anyway because it was too fine to throw away. Visitors would have been few and familiar. Letters, when they came, would have had the slow handwriting of those who still used paper. The palace grounds may have sounded distant, but the air had the same old texture, the mixed scent of stone, grass and polish that she had known since 1858. The close of a life in such surroundings tends to be formalised by the notices that newspapers print in tidy columns. In early January 1927, several such notices appeared together, each telling the same essential truth in slightly different phrasings. Anne Pullman, long a pensioner of Queen Victoria's household, had died at 94, at the cottage in the grounds of Kensington Palace, where she had lived for many years. Those lines sit at the junction of the private and the public. They were not the fulsome obituaries that greet a statesman, but neither were they the two-word summaries that pass without trace. In a city that forgets quickly, they paused long enough to say that service had been seen and remembered. The notices that sailed briefly across London's newspapers in January 1927 did more than mark an ending. They reopened questions. They sketched Anne in the outline everyone agreed upon: long service, pensioner of the late Queen, death in a cottage at Kensington. Then they added strokes that begged for scrutiny. Some writers, reaching for a flourish, said that after her years as linen room woman, she had been advanced to assist one of Queen Victoria's dressing women. Another went further still, asserting that in her nursery days she had charge of the boy who would become King Edward VII. These claims have a plausible ring. They nestle comfortably inside a popular imagination that likes to draw the faithful servant a little closer to the heart of power. But court life does not run on sentiment. It runs on records. We have to lift each assertion, feel its weight, and place it against what the household's own papers can support. Begin with the gentler claim, an appointment assisting a dressing woman in the latter part of her career. The title dresser or dressing woman did not mean a seamstress. It drew one into the Queen's most private orbit, where the rituals of dressing and undressing were matters of careful routine and unspoken protocols. To assist such a figure was to stand near the thresholds where only a handful were allowed, and misjudgments were not forgiven. Could Anne have moved from the linen room into that narrow circle? The shape of her experience certainly fit the prerequisites: discretion that had never cracked, a mastery of textiles and their behaviour, a reputation for reliability strong enough that people trusted her to do things the right way without being told twice. If a dresser needed an assistant who could anticipate fabrics and manage the silent fuss of garments, Anne would have been a prime candidate. Yet the household file that names her promotions and entries is silent on a title, change beyond linen keeper. Silence does not always mean something did not occur. Small adjustments of duty inside a department often went unrecorded if they did not alter pay or station. It is easy to imagine, especially after the tumult of the Golden Jubilee and the steady sorrow of subsequent years, that a seasoned hand like Anne's might be seconded occasionally to the wardrobes near the royal apartments, particularly during periods when mourning or ceremony increased the load. The newspaper's wording, assistant to one of the dressing women, has the sound of a recollection rather than a formal designation, a description of function more than rank. In that sense, it may be true in spirit and partly true in fact, a phrase that tells us how people remembered her usefulness in the last stretch of active duty, even if the ledger never changed her line. The bolder statement, the one that gives her charge of the young Prince of Wales, deserves a firmer testing. The calendar is our first tool. Anne's documented tenure as personal nursery maid centres on Princess Beatrice between 1866 and 1868. By then, the Prince of Wales was a grown man in his mid-20s and long since out of any nursery. If the newspaper meant literal charge, the timing collapses immediately. Perhaps the writer intended a looser idea, that in earlier nursery service she sometimes tended royal children generally, and that the paper's wish for grandeur converted proximity into command. If we roll the dates back into the late 1850s and early 1860s, when Anne first entered the nursery and the Prince of Wales was still a youth, the social architecture still argues against the notion. The heir's upbringing had a structure built like a fortress, with a dedicated staff whose names appear elsewhere. A general nursery maid, even a particularly capable one, might be in the same rooms or corridors. She might soothe another child while the heir's attendants were engaged. She might carry linens through the spaces where he slept, but charge implies an official responsibility that, in the prince's case, would have been an appointment loud enough to leave footprints. The Westminster notice that set the claim before the public reads like a flourish, added by someone who understood that the phrase "had charge of the king" would sell a column inch better than "worked long in the nursery." The court's papers have no reason to exaggerate, and they do not. It is wise, when confronting such mismatches, not to draw the wrong conclusion. The impulse to magnify a servant's proximity to greatness is old and can be forgiven, but it can also obscure the smaller truth that is more instructive. Anne's distinction does not depend on whether she buttoned a prince's boots. It lies in the way she carried a department that supported royal lives without ever calling attention to itself. If anything, the newspaper's embroidery tells us something useful about how her service was perceived by those who encountered it. The instinct to bind her story to better-known figures is a mark of respect, an acknowledgement that her quiet work belonged to the same unity of labour that upheld the sovereign household as a whole. Rhetorically, the writers pulled her toward the centre. Historically, she had already earned her place by keeping the edges strong. There is another way to read those notices, as a chorus harmonising over a few agreed notes. They name her a long-serving pensioner. They situate her in the Kensington cottage. They put her age at 94. They remember her connection to Queen Victoria's reign. Even when they drift into doubtful flourishes, they remain correct in the elements that matter most to a life's public outline. Their errors become more instructive if we ask what kinds of details newspapers are better at. They excel at tone, at the shared memory of a city that somehow knows which lives are meant to be nodded to on a winter morning. They are poor at departmental titles and internal hierarchies. Seen that way, their weakness is our strength. It reminds us to return to ledgers and index cards for the hard bones of chronology, while taking from the press the warmth of atmosphere. Against the paper chatter, the state's last notice strips everything to essentials. Probate is uninterested in romance. On 23rd March 1927, the will of Anne Pullman was proved, stating that she had died on 2nd January and listing her effects at 111 4/4. Tender, a sum that feels small until one remembers how modestly a single woman of steady but uncelebrated means might have lived in a grace and favour cottage. The bequest went to Mary Alberta Keating, a widow. There is a quiet story there, though the record does not tell it. Perhaps Mary had been a relation by marriage, or a friend whose kindness had become as constant as furniture. Perhaps she had served within the household in some lesser capacity, and had kept an eye on Anne when errands multiplied. Whoever she was, the gesture follows the logic of Anne's whole history. A practical kindness expressed without speech-making. The probate line does more than place a beneficiary. It hands us the texture of an ending. Effects valued just above £100 suggest a room where the most expensive things were well made rather than numerous. A solid chest, an armchair with honest wear, a box of keepsakes, letters tied with a ribbon, Perhaps a photograph of a wedding party in which she stood off to one side, because servants did not generally stand in front. A few pieces of good linen might have been among the things. One cannot help but wonder if she kept some small monogrammed item as a talisman of work done carefully for a very long time. In such cottages, the accumulation of objects is not clutter, but a map of decades, each piece earned, chosen, or, more often, kept because it had proved itself. Return, then, to the institutional document that gave her the most unusual wealth of all. The line acknowledging her grace and favour occupation in Kensington was more than an address. It was a guarantee of security that few of her birth could have expected. Grace and favour is a phrase with an old flavour, often misunderstood as caprice. In practice, it functioned as a continuation of duty across a life, the sovereign's house assuming responsibility for the shelter of those who had given it their years. It preserved community in a literal sense. The grounds were familiar, the faces near at hand belonged to people who spoke the same language of service, and the boundaries of the place matched the contours of memory. To die where one had lived so long is not a failure to depart, it is a more complete arrival. If we set her story alongside the era's wider currents, a subtler achievement emerges. Victorian Britain built systems that separated those who were seen from those who supplied the seeing. The palace amplified that distinction until it became a principle. Pageantry at the front, precision at the back. Anne navigated that architecture without losing herself in it. Her illegitimate birth marked her as marginal in a parish register. Her conduct made that mark irrelevant within one of the most punctilious hierarchies in the kingdom. She did not change her country, but she did what is harder to celebrate and easier to live by. She allowed an institution to work at its best by ensuring that her portion of it never faltered. By the time she retired, her absence would have been noticed, not because voices were raised, but because lists, for a while, felt a half-beat off. The historiography of people like Anne is not barren, it is simply quiet. The sources are administrative, and the tone is plain. A career can be read in lines that contain more numbers than adjectives. This invites a particular way of writing, one that reconstitutes life from habit, that hears character in the steady repetition of tasks rather than the sharp report of declarations. Anne's life is a kind of proof that this method yields something firm. When we trace her from a baptism that carried a hint of a father's name to a palace file that spelled out her promotions and a census that placed her in a cottage kept by old loyalties, the connective tissue remains strong enough to bend but not break under the weight of inference. A modern reader, taught to look for heroics, may miss the point if they demand a single dramatic act. The drama is duration. In a world that wears down even the best intentions, she sustained hers until they became indistinguishable from the fabric she handled. Nor should we pass lightly over the relationship between women's work and memory. Much of what keeps a house safe and clean has historically been entrusted to women, and much of that labour leaves no inscription beyond the absence of complaint. The linen room's triumph is that no guest ever felt poorly served. Its disaster would have been instantly visible and loudly remembered. In this calculus, success vanishes into normality and is therefore immeasurable. Anne's ledger entries, the neatness of her inventories, the polite definiteness with which she must have refused a late, impossible request. These are the only monuments such a life claims. They are unobtrusive, but not trivial. One might ask what, if anything, the young Anne would have thought if someone had whispered her future into her ear on the morning of that 1851 census in Honiton. The notion of palace service might have seemed unreal to a girl who rose in a schoolmistress's house to warm grates and scrub surfaces men ignored. And yet the habit of order she learned there is the same habit that made her valuable in London. It is tempting to call her journey improbable. It is better to call it legible, One good line of conduct drawn across 40 years in which many wills, large and small, pressed against her and found no reason to doubt. That is not the stuff of headlines, but newspapers will sometimes, decades later, try to make headlines out of it anyway. When they do, their misremembering is itself a tribute. The final shape of her public afterlife belongs to the way institutions file her name, in the Lord Chamberlain's lists, in the pension, sore register, in the censor's volumes. Private afterlife is a different matter. It resides in the way a few rooms feel when a person leaves them. In 1927, there would have been a day when Jeannie Roger Warman, whose role we infer as steady companion and attendant, stood in the middle of the cottage and measured how much silence had entered. Papers would be gathered, drawers sorted. The familiar rustle of a careful woman moving linen would no longer sound against wood and plaster. At some hour, the keys would be carried to an office where a clerk understood what they were and what they had been. Another attendant would be assigned to the cottage in time, and another life would inhabit the rooms. But for a while, the place would keep Anne's shape, the measure that long residence presses into space, like an old fold that takes time to ease out. The fourth and closing part must bring the threads together without overstating any single one. It will gather the evidence we trust, acknowledge the warmth, if not the precision, of those obituary embellishments, and set her legacy in the context that honours the scale at which she lived. It will also trace one last line across the period, from the quiet rituals of palace work to the quieter gifts that followed, from a girl written down in a parish book with a blank space where a father's name should have stood to a woman, whose address became a form of esteem. In that arc there is a lesson about how a life becomes dignified without ever becoming grand, and why such dignity is worth reading closely. To close a life like Anne's, one has to resist the urge to manufacture a finale. Palace service seldom offers the dramatic curtain fall we are trained to expect. Instead, endings arrive in the measured language of ledgers and the gentler vowels of rooms that grow quiet. The pieces we hold are exact enough: an entry noting retirement, a pension apportioned from 2 purses, a grace and favour cottage within Kensington's grounds, a census in 1921 that writes pensioner beside her name, and records an attendant who steadied her last years, a cluster of January notices in 1927 that carry the news of her death, and a probate line that assigns her effects and closes the account. If that seems spare, it is only because we have learned to mistake noise for meaning. The meaning here is duration, a life carried plainly and well, from a village baptism with a blank where a father's name should have stood to an address that needed no apology. The question that lingers is how to read virtue from routine without making it sentimental. In a world so stratified by rank, where the distance between a sovereign's dais and the housemaid's pail could feel unbridgeable, the household functioned only because thousands of such distances were crossed by habit every day. Anne's gift was to make those crossings invisible. She kept lists that did not lie. She taught a standard with her hands. She learned when to speak and when to answer with movement alone. In the nursery, that meant the soft governance of small tempers and the steadiness that turns a sequence of tasks into a child's sense of safety. In the linen room, it meant the orchestration of fabric as infrastructure, the unseen girders under ceremonies the country remembers. If we look for a single heroic deed, we will miss the point. The heroism was in never letting the thread break. There is also the matter of trust, the currency by which a court truly runs. Titles and uniforms declare authority, but continuity belongs to those whose work no one thinks to question. The record that places Anne next to Princess Beatrice in the later 1860s tells us that she had been tested where error would have echoed. The later promotion to linen room woman tells us that she was then trusted with an inventory whose failure would have embarrassed a monarch. And though we cannot certify the newspaper's flourish about assisting a dressing woman, we can understand why the image appealed. People who knew Anne's competence wanted to place it near the centre, because in practice, the centre had already leaned on it. Institutions compose their memory out of such instincts, and even their inaccuracies, when they enlarge service into proximity, carry a kind of respect. The grace and favour cottage is the most eloquent sentence the household ever wrote about her. One might misread it as indulgence. It is better understood as recognition, not for publicity but for quiet use. Such residences formed a small, almost monastic republic of former service within palace precincts. Retired ladies in waiting, widows of officers, long-serving attendants, people who had given their adult lives to a place, and were granted the safety of remaining within its walls when their hands could no longer keep time with its bells. To be allowed to end one's days, there is to be told, gently and without oratory, that one belongs. For someone whose first legal appearance in the world was shadowed by illegitimacy, that belonging is not only material, it is dignitary. The cottage rewrites the blank line in the baptism register with a different kind of name. Not a patronymic, but a place. When the probate figure is set down, 111, for has attend, the temptation is to judge it as small. But money is only one measure of wealth, and not always the best. Anne's account closes with modest sums, because the things that would have made an auctioneer's list never anchored her worth. Her wages were paid in stability while she worked. Her retirement was paid in certainty and address. The objects in her rooms would have been good because they lasted, not because they startled the eye. She would have preferred a chair that did not wobble to an heirloom that required ceremony. If she kept any treasures, they were the kind that memory polishes, perhaps a letter from a fellow servant now gone, or a keepsake pressed into her hand by a princess she had once attended as a child. Such things do not push up the value of an estate, but they increase the value of a life. It is useful, too, to set her path against the geography of class movement available to a 19th century woman without a father's name in her register. Options were narrow. Remain near the parish and accept the village's memory of your beginning, seek a husband and exchange one vulnerability for another, or enter service and let conduct replace pedigree. Service, for all its strictures, could be a ladder if one learned its grammar. Anne learned it early. She stepped from a schoolmistress's house in Honiton into a palace not by luck alone, but by the slow mathematics of recommendation. Competence observed, character attested, discretion assumed until it was no longer noticed. If we think of social mobility only in terms of speeches and votes, we will miss this other route, lower to the ground and less recorded, by which many women forged secure lives inside large households that measured status in internal titles and trust. The ladder had rungs close together, and it never left the building, but it rose. The evidence we have also teaches a method. Much of ordinary life in the past survives not as stories, but as fragments. Names that vary by a vowel, dates that need reconciling, roles that shift their titles across the years. The only honest way to reconstruct such a life is to sit with those fragments until they consent to line up. Here, the parish register gives us a birth and a clue to a father's family name embedded as a middle name. The 1841 census places a child with an older couple we have reason to see as grandparents, demonstrating the parish's habit of absorbing its complexities. The 1851 return sets her in Honiton exactly the right age, with an employer whose house trained her for larger work. Then the palace record arrives like a seal, entry into the nursery in May 1858, a birth date that aligns with the baptism, and later the index card that ties her to Princess Beatrice. A decade more, and the linen room opens, followed by the census that calls her linen room woman, and the later one that calls her linen keeper. At each step, the details agree just enough to carry weight. Where the newspapers embellish, we test and correct without losing the affection that moved them to write. Where the line grows thin, we say so and stop because restraint is part of accuracy. If a moral rises from these pages, it is modest and durable. Institutions remember themselves through ceremony. They actually survive through competence, and belong to the second category, the quiet competence that makes the first possible. When the banqueting tables gleamed in 1887 and the white expanse ran without crease, there were names at the top of the programme and photographs of the procession, but the event's perfection leaned on the care of a woman whose name does not feature in the pictorial record. The nation loved its spectacle. Anne loved straight hems and accurate lists. Between those loves, there is a contract. The palace kept its side when it granted her pension and home. She kept hers for 30 years, with a steadiness that asked for nothing beyond the chance to do it again tomorrow. It is tempting to imagine one last scene, unrecorded, but consistent with the grain of her life. A winter afternoon inside the Kensington cottage, the light thin, the fire at a working pace rather than a show of flame. On a small table, a cloth laid true, not out of display, but because hands that have folded with care for decades cannot lay a cloth carelessly. Perhaps a visitor sits opposite, Jeanie with a mending basket, or the widow who would later be named in the will. They speak in low tones about the weather, about the gardener who has been replaced by a younger man, who keeps a sharper edge on the shears, about the memory of a wedding long ago, when a certain damask refused to give up its crease until it was coaxed with patience and a cooler iron. Outside, the palace grounds hold their posture. Inside, the room breathes the same calm. Nothing announces itself as history, and yet this is exactly how history is kept. So the arc is complete. A child baptized under a cloud grows into a servant trusted in corridors where mistakes echo, then into a keeper of the palace's fabric, in more senses than one, then into a pensioner whose very address states what she earned. The public record, properly read, grants her what rhetoric often withholds from the obscure. Not pity, not borrowed grandeur, but respect. She did not speak from a throne, she steadied the floor beneath it. That is not a lesser sentence, it is simply written in a different tense, the present continuous of work done faithfully until time itself, not applause, called it finished.